Hello, everyone. Got a few dirty jokes for you today.
So one very hot, dry day, a local cowboy visited the reservation. He went there from time to mingle with the Indians. There was this one Indian that the cowboy has become friends with. This Indian from pretty much a loner from all the other tribe. He was all alone. His parents got killed in battle, and he had no squaw that he claimed as his own. This cowboy felt sorry for the lonely Indian. He told him that he could help him overcome being so lonely. But he would have to go into the nearby town. Told him to go into the town saloon and walk up to the bar. There would be a lady standing behind the bar. Tell her that you want a woman. She will take care of you. I will tell her to be expecting you. Next day, the Indian went into town and walked up to the bar in the saloon. The Indian began this conversation with the lady. The Indian said, "Me want a woman." The lady replied, "How much money do you have?" The Indian asked, "What is money?" The lady explained, "It is something that you must have to spend time with one of my girls." She explained to the Indian what money was. So the Indian left and told her that he would return. A couple of days passed, and the Indian returned. He approached the bar. The Indian said, "Me want a woman." The lady replied, "Did you get you any money?" The Indian said, "Yeah, me got plenty of money." "So," the lady asked, "do you have any experience with a woman?" Confused, the Indian asked, "What you mean by experience?" The lady explained, "You have to be experienced to spend time with my girls." The lady explained to the Indian how he could get his experience. Lady said, "You go to the mountains and find a big tree. Make sure it is one that has a knothole in it. You will be able to get all the experience you wish. Then when you feel that you have all the experience that you can get, you can come back here and I will have one of my girls take care of your needs." The Indian left the town and went up into the mountains. 1 week passed by before the Indian returned. The next week, the Indian returned to the saloon. He was very angry and very aggressive with the lady behind the counter. The Indian said, "Me want a woman, and me want woman right now." The lady asked, "Have you gotten any experience since you were here last?" The Indian told her, "Me got all kinds of experience and a bag full of money. Me want woman now." The lady told him, "All right, follow me to the top of the stairs." The Indian followed her to the top of the steps to a door. He opened the door and there stood the most lovely woman he had ever seen. He closed the door behind him and walked up to the woman. She asked, "What would you like for me to do?" The woman began removing all of her clothes, also the Indian. The Indian asked, "Turn around and bend them over and touch your toes." She liked that ideal, so she turned around and bent over like the Indian asked. The Indian stepped up behind the woman and pulled back his leg and kicked her in the ass. The woman jumped up in surprise. She asked the Indian, "What in the hell did you have to do that for?" The Indian looked at the woman and replied, "Me, checking for bees in that knothole." So 2 cowboys come upon an Indian lying on his stomach with his ear to the ground. One of the cowboys stops and says to the other, "What do you think he's doing?" The other replies, "He's listening to the ground. Indians can hear things for miles in any direction by vibrations." Just then, the Indian looks up and says, "Covered wagon some 2 miles away. Have 2 horses, 1 brown, 1 white. Man, woman, child, household effects in wagon." The second cowboy shouts, "That's incredible. This Indian knows how far away they are, how many horses, what color they are, who is in the wagon, and what's in the wagon. Damn amazing." The Indian looks up and says, "No, they ran over me about a half hour ago." So an old Indian chief sat in his hut on the reservation, smoking a ceremonial pipe and eyeing two U.S. government officials sent to interview him. One official asked the chief, "You have observed the white man for 90 years. You've seen his wars and his material wealth. You've seen his progress and the damage he has done." The chief nodded that it was so. The official continued, "Considering all these events, in your opinion, where did the white man go wrong?" The chief stared at the government officials for over a minute and then calmly replied, "When white man found the land, Indians were running it. No taxes, no debt, plenty buffalo, plenty beaver. Women did all the work. Medicine man was free. Indian man spent all day hunting and fishing, all night making love." Then the chief leaned back and smiled. Only white man dumb enough to think he could improve on a system like that. So a Native American man lived in the big city all his life. Then one day, his father dies. When he goes home to the reserve for the funeral, the people all nominate him to be the new chief, since he was a successful businessman and his father was a good chief. He accepts. But then that autumn, the people come to him and ask him if it will be a cold winter that year. The man has no idea, since he was raised in the city all his life and doesn't know any of the people's traditional teachings. So, to be on the safe side, he says, "Yes, better start gathering firewood." So they do. Later that week, he decides to call up the National Weather Service and ask them what the forecast is for that winter. They say, apparently, it's going to be pretty cold this year. So he orders his people to gather twice as much firewood. The next week, he calls the Weather Service again to ask if there are any updates on the forecast. They say yes. Apparently, it's going to be even colder than we previously thought. So the chief tells his people to gather 3 times the firewood they normally would. He calls the Weather Service one more time, and the man tells him it's probably going to be the coldest winter in history. The chief asks how they know that, and the man tells him, "I have no idea, but the Indians down at the local reserve have been gathering firewood like mad." So a cowboy and a Native American are riding the prairie. The Native American stops his horse, looks around and swings off. He presses his ear to the ground, and after a few seconds, straightens up and says, "Buffalo come." "Amazing," says the cowboy. "How can you tell?" The Native American replies, "Ear's Ticky." So one day, a young boy from a Native American tribe entered the chief's teepee and asked, "Chief, how do we get our names?" Like, how did Full Moon get his name? The chief replied, when he was conceived, there was a full moon in the sky. The boy thought about this, then asked, "And what about Fast Buck?" The chief answered, "A fast buck ran by the teepee on the night he was conceived." The boy nodded, "Thank you, chief." The chief smiled and said, "Anytime, broken rubber." So an old Wild West fort is about to be attacked. The wild old general sends for his trusty Native American scout. "You must use all your 30 years of skill in trying to estimate the sort of army we are up against here." The trusty scout lies down and puts his ear to the ground. "Large war party," he says. "Maybe 300 braves, 4 chiefs, 2 on black stallions, 2 on white stallions. All have war paint. Many, many guns. Medicine men are also with them." "Good grief," exclaims the general. "You can tell all of that just by listening to the ground?" "No," he replies. "I can see under the gate." So Jack and Tom are having a beer in a saloon when a cowboy walks in, carrying an Indian's head under his arm. He hands it to the bartender, who gives him a stack of cash. Turning to Jack and Tom, the bartender says, "I hate Indians. Last week, they burned my barn to the ground and killed my wife and 3 kids. Anybody who brings me the head of an Indian gets $1,000. Jack and Tom finish their beers, nod to each other, and head out to hunt. After a while, they finally spot an Indian. Jack picks up a rock, hurls it, and hits the Indian square on the head. The Indian falls off his horse, tumbling 70 feet down a ravine. The 2 cowboys scramble down the ravine, and Tom pulls out his knife, ready to claim their bounty. Just as he's about to do the deed, Jack nudges him. "Tom, you might want to take a look at this." Tom, focused on his prize, says, "Can't you see I'm busy? I've got $1,000 in my hand." But Jack insists. "Seriously." Tom look up. With a sigh, Tom glances up to the top of the ravine, and there are 5,000 Indians lined up, watching them. Tom's eyes go wide. "Well, damn, we're gonna be millionaires." So Fred was driving home from one of his business trips in northern Arizona when he saw an elderly Navajo man walking on the side of the road. As the trip was a long and quiet one, he stopped the car and asked the Navajo man if he would like a ride. With a silent nod of thanks, the Indian got into the car. Resuming the journey, Fred tried to make a bit of small talk with the Navajo man. The old man just sat silently, looking intently at everything he saw, studying every little detail until he noticed a brown bag on the seat next to Fred. "What's in the bag?" asked the old man. Fred looked down at the brown bag and said, "It's a bottle of wine. I got it for my wife." The Navajo man was silent for another moment or two. Then, speaking with the quiet wisdom of an elder, he said, "Good trade." So an old Native American wanted a loan for $500. The banker pulled out the loan application. "What are you going to do with the money?" he asks. "Buy silver, make jewelry, and sell to white man." "What have you got for collateral?" "Don't know collateral," replied the old man. "Well, that's something of value that would cover the cost of the loan in case you cannot repay it. Do you have any vehicles?" "Yes, 1949 Chevy pickup," replied the native. The banker shook his head. "How about livestock?" "Yes, I have horse," replied the man. "How old is it?" the banker asks. "Don't know, have no teeth." After humming and hawing, the banker finally decides to make the $500 loan. Several weeks later, the old man was back in the bank. "Here to pay," he said, pulling out one of several bundles of notes from his bag and handing it to the banker to pay his loan. "What are you going to do with the rest of that money?" the banker asks. "Take home," replied the native. "Why don't you deposit it in my bank?" the banker asked. "Don't know deposit," replied the man. "You put the money in our bank, and we take care of it for you. Whenever you want to use it, you can withdraw it." The old man leaned across the desk and asks the banker, "What you got for collateral?" So a Native American walks into a coffee shop with a shotgun in one hand, pulling a male buffalo with the other, and says to the waiter, "Want coffee?" The waiter says, "Sure, Chief, coming right up." He gets the Native American a tall mug of coffee. After drinking the coffee down in one gulp, the Native American turns and blasts the buffalo with the shotgun, then just walks out. The next morning, the man returns. He has his shotgun in one hand, pulling another male buffalo with the other. He walks up to the counter and says to the waiter, "Want coffee?" The waiter says, "Whoa, Tonto, We're still cleaning up your mess from yesterday. What the heck was all that about anyway? The Native American smiles and proudly says, training for an upper management position. Come in, drink coffee, shoot the bull, leave a mess for others to clean up, disappear for the rest of the day. A young Native American woman went to a doctor for her first ever physical exam. After checking all of her vitals and running the usual tests, the doctor said, "Well, Running Doe, you are in fine health." I could find no problems. I did notice one anomaly, however. "Oh, what is that, doctor?" "Well, you have no nipples." "None of the people in my tribe have nipples," she replied. "That is amazing," said the doctor. "I'd like to write this up for the South Carolina Journal of Medicine, if you don't mind." She said, "Okay." First of all, asked the doctor, "How many people are in your tribe?" She answered, "Approximately 500. "And what is the name of your tribe?" asked the doctor. Running Doe replied, "We're called the Indian Nippleless 500. So a man asked an American Indian what was his wife's name. He replied, "She called 4 horses." The man said, "That's an unusual name for your wife." "What does it mean?" The old Indian answered, "It's an old Indian name. It means nag, 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 nag." So the Lone Ranger was ambushed and captured by a hostile Indian war party. The Indian chief approached him and said, "So, you are the great Lone Ranger. In honor of the Harvest Festival, you will be executed in 3 days. But before I kill you, I will grant you 3 requests." "What is your first request?" The Lone Ranger thought for a moment and said, "I'd like to speak to my horse." The chief nodded, and Silver was brought before the Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger whispered something in Silver's ear, and the horse galloped away. Later that evening, Silver returned with a beautiful blonde woman on his back. As the Indian chief watched, the blonde entered the Lone Ranger's tent and spent the night. The next morning, the Indian chief was impressed. "You have a very fine and loyal horse, but I will still kill you in 2 days. What is your second request?" The Lone Ranger asked again. "I'd like to speak to my horse." Silver was brought to him, and once more the Lone Ranger whispered in the horse's ear. Silver took off across the plains and disappeared over the horizon. That evening, to the chief's amazement, Silver returned this time with a stunning brunette, even more beautiful than the blonde. She entered the Lone Ranger's tent and spent the night. The following morning, the Indian chief couldn't help but admire the Lone Ranger. "You are indeed a man of many talents, but I still have to kill you tomorrow. What is your final request?" The Lone Ranger replied, "I'd like to speak to my horse, alone." The chief, curious, agreed, and Silver was brought to the Lone Ranger's tent. Once they were alone, the Lone Ranger grabbed Silver by both ears, looked him square in the eye, and said, "Listen very carefully, you dumb horse. For the last time, I said bring posse." So an Indian visited a local school to give a presentation. He spoke about growing up on the Navajo reservation and told the students about their culture, traditions, and heritage. Afterwards, he offered to teach them a few words in the Navajo language. "How do you say hello?" a student asked. "Yati," he replied. "How about good morning?" "Ya, tiabini," he said. Then little Johnny spoke up. "How do you say, 'Screw you bastard,' in Navajo?" Taken aback, he thought about it and then answered, "That's an interesting question. In our language, there are no cuss words." "How can there be no cuss words?" Johnny said. "What do you say if you're speaking your language and having an argument with your wife?" "In that case," the speaker said, "we switch to your language." So once upon a time, a woman found herself navigating the vast and desolate landscapes of remote Arizona. Murphy's Law being what it is, her trusty vehicle decided to take an unscheduled break, leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere. As she pondered her predicament, a gallant American Indian on horseback emerged from the horizon like a desert mirage. Offering a kind smile and a helping hand, he invited her to join him on his majestic steed for a ride to the nearest town. Grateful for the unexpected rescue, the woman hopped on behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist while clutching the saddle. The journey commenced, and to her surprise, it turned out to be a peculiarly vocal adventure. At regular intervals, the Indian would release a thunderous yeehaw that reverberated through the canyons and hills, adding an unexpected soundtrack to the arid landscape. Eventually reaching the town, the Indian bid her farewell with one last triumphant yeehaw, before disappearing into the horizon. Puzzled but amused, the woman headed to the local service station to address the needs of her temperamental car. The curious service station attendant couldn't help but inquire, "What on earth did you do to get that Indian so excited?" Smirking, the woman replied, "Believe it or not, I just sat behind him on the horse, wrapped my arms around his waist, and held onto the saddle horn to avoid falling off." With an arched eyebrow, the attendant chuckled and corrected her. "Lady, Indians don't use saddles." So once upon a time, a young man from the city decided to take a trip out west to explore the country. During his travels, he came across a small Native American village nestled in a valley. He had never seen anything like it before and was fascinated by the culture and traditions of the tribe. As he wandered through the village, he came across a young Native American woman who smiled at him and struck up a conversation. She told him stories of her people and their way of life, and he found himself captivated by her words. After a while, she suggested that he should visit the chief, who was known to have the greatest memory in the world. The young man was intrigued and decided to take her advice. He made his way to the chief's hut and was greeted by an old man with wise eyes and a kind smile. The chief welcomed him and offered him a seat by the fire. "I hear you have the greatest memory in the world," said the young man. The chief nodded. "That is true. I remember every detail of my life, from the day I was born to this very moment." The young man was skeptical. "Prove it," he said. The chief thought for a moment before replying. "On April 27th, 1959, I had 2 eggs for breakfast." The young man was stunned. He had not expected the chief to remember such a specific detail from so many years ago. Satisfied, the young man said goodbye to the chief and continued on his journey. But he never forgot about the chief and his incredible memory. 20 years later, the young man found himself back in the same part of the country and decided to visit the village once again. To his amazement, the chief was still alive and well. The young man approached the chief and raised his hand in greeting. "How?" he said. The chief looked at him for a moment before replying with a smile. "Fried." So it was election season, and a politician, eager to secure votes, decided to visit a local Native American reservation. He wanted to win over the crowd, so he gave a grand speech in the council hall where the entire community had gathered to listen. As he built up to his big promises, the crowd grew more and more enthusiastic. "I promise better education opportunities for Native Americans," he declared. The crowd erupted, shouting, "Hoya! Hoya!" Their cheers and excitement boosted the politician's confidence, though he didn't quite understand the word Hoya. Still, he figured it must mean something positive. Feeling encouraged, he continued, "I promise gambling reforms to allow a casino right here on the reservation." Again, the crowd cheered even louder. "Hoya! Hoya!" They stomped their feet, clearly loving every word. The politician smiled, deciding to go all in. "And I promise more social reforms and job opportunities for Native Americans." The crowd reached a fever pitch, chanting, "Hoya! Hoya! Hoya!" Their energy was off the charts. After the speech, feeling proud of his performance, the politician was given a tour of the reservation. As they walked, he noticed a large herd of cattle grazing nearby. Since he grew up on a ranch, he asked the chief if he could take a closer look. "Of course," the chief said with a smile, "but be careful not to step in the Hoya."